All right, we are live. So for any of you out there, you are joining the Massage Therapy Journal Club. I'm Chris Moyer, and I'm joined today by Mark Retzlaff. Mark, how you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Oh, thanks for joining us. Whoops. All right, I was listening to myself there, probably getting feedback. Hopefully we're all still set. You still hearing me, Mark? Mark, are you still hearing me?
Oh, yep. You're a little laggy there from time to time, but
okay.
I gotcha.
Okay. Mark and I are going to be discussing an article today about whether or not massage therapy alleviates delayed onset muscle soreness. Let me tell you a little bit about Mark. Mark posted this article to my Facebook group and had some questions about it, and I thought it was a really good and interesting article, and I think the results are worth discussing. Let me tell you a little bit about Mark. Mark has been a massage therapist since 2011. He first started working in the spa industry and recently opened his own private practice, Portland Massage and Pain Care. He's the education chair for AMTA Oregon, and he's an advocate for healthcare integration for massage, especially for pain management. His favorite education topics include pain science, clinical communication, trauma-informed care, and cultural competency. He also enjoys playing guitar and trail running. I play guitar too.
Well, let's not jam at the end of this.
No, we should just do it now. We should just set aside the science and just start playing maybe. Hey, I noticed a few minutes ago, speaking of your background and your interest here, that you posted about an educational conference coming up in your area. Do you want to say a little bit about that?
Oh, I'd love to. Yeah, this was this is the first time I've ever done anything like this, and I'm kind of inspired by Rajam Roos and the San Diego Pain Summit. You know, she's kind of famously said she couldn't afford to travel all over the place to go to these conferences that she wanted to. So she just brought people to her city, and I kind of was able to do that a little bit myself. And every one of my top choices said yes. So this is coming up April 7th and 8th at the National University of Natural Medicine here in Portland for a 2-day conference. We've got Whitney Lowe, Todd Hargrove, a member of the Oregon Pain Management Commission is going to be there, Ruth Werner, Elaine Walters, who started the Trauma Healing Project in Eugene, Oregon, is going to be talking about trauma-informed care.
Are there still?
Plus,
I'm sorry.
There's a couple more names I wanted to shout out, because Rachel Scott, who some of the people might recognize from the forums, and Julie Campbell is going to teach an insurance billing class. So I tried to get a little something for everything, but obviously my interests in pain science and trauma-informed care are heavily featured in the lineup.
Terrific. Pardon me for interrupting. I was eager to ask if there are still open spots for attendees.
Oh, we're just ready to make the announcement, so nobody knows about the lineup yet. So
okay.
The tickets are not on sale yet. That'll be coming.
Okay, where should people go if they want to read more about it or register?
The best way is to like AMTA Oregon on Facebook, or visit the website. What we really need to do is find a way to put a box on the website where people can go and sign up for the email list. But with, I guess, the tools we have from AMTA National for our website builder, it's really hard to do that. So we need to come up with a workaround so that people can get signed up for the email list. But definitely like and follow us. I'm sure we'll do a sponsored Facebook ad, so it should be able to reach people that way. And then,
okay, well, that sounds good. For the time being, people checking in with your AMTA Oregon Facebook page sounds like probably the best way to go.
Yep.
Great. All right. Well, thanks for telling us about that. Let me just note one or two things about this project before you and I go into the article itself. So I previously did 2 episodes of this journal club idea. I was hoping to create something on YouTube that is similar to what a group of students might do, or a group of students in combination with a professor might do when they have a particular interest in an area. They read something together, then get together and discuss it, known as a journal club. And my first efforts to do this online, I tried to get 5 or 6 people involved, which on the one hand is a cool way to do it. On the other hand, with the lag and the technology involved and coordinating everyone with time, it turned out to be unwieldy. And after thinking about it a little bit, I think the way to try to make this work more effectively is going to be to streamline it, where I have one guest, like I have with Mark today. Guest is really the wrong term. You're not my guest. I mean, we're doing this together. But one other participant, or maybe 2. And I'm going to try to do one of these a week for an extended period of time and see if we can build some interest and momentum in this. In relation to that, and I hate publicizing myself, but one of the things I want to do is I want to see if I can make this a self-sustaining project. And so this goes out for free, but if you find value in this and you want to support it, there is a link to my brand new Patreon account in the YouTube video description. So if you think this is something that is worth supporting, I invite you to do that. So, and thank you for doing that. So Mark, as I mentioned, posted this article to my Facebook group recently entitled "Massage Alleviates Delayed Onset Muscle Soreness After Strenuous Exercise, a Systematic Review and Meta-Analysis." And this is by a group of authors from China. I'm going to do a terrible job on their names, I'm sure, but Guo, Li, Gong, Zhu, and Chen. And this was published just this year in 2017. And Mark, do you want to say a little bit about what caught your eye with this article and what led you to post it in the group?
Yeah, well, just that it contradicted some of my biases and my understanding of the research on DOMS. If we can just say DOMS, that'll really shorten things for me. So muscle soreness. Yeah, I mean, my sense from reading, painscience.com and Paul Ingraham's work, that really was a big part of my previous impression of whether massage works, whether cryotherapy works, and all that. So when I saw this, they came with a pretty strong outcome in favor of massage. So I was like, kind of sniffing around on it and wanting to get some other eyeballs on it and see what y'all thought about the quality of the study.
Okay. Yeah, so they reach some pretty strong conclusions. So they use meta-analysis, which is a technique for aggregating individual studies and using some statistical techniques to combine the results of those. And we now have quite a few of these in the area of massage therapy research. I've done a couple myself. And the results that they report here, they say 11 articles with a total of 23 data points. I think what they mean by that is outcome points at which outcomes were assessed, involving 504 participants, satisfied the inclusion criteria and were pooled in the meta-analysis. The findings demonstrated that muscle soreness rating decreased significantly when participants received massage intervention compared to no intervention. At 24 hours, I'm going to skip over all the numbers and the statistics here, at 48 hours, and in total. Oh, also at 72 hours and in total after intense exercise. I'm doing a bad job of reading this, but there's a lot of statistics stuck in here. Additionally, massage therapy improved MIF, which stands for Maximal Isometric Force, I think, and peak torque as total effects. Furthermore, the serum creatine kinase level was reduced when participants received massage significantly. So all of the things that they looked at, they got a significant finding for. And then we're going to dig into the specific statistics a little bit more, because one of the things that Mark mentioned when he posted it was that, yes, maybe there are statistically significant effects here, but are they ones that we should be impressed with? Are they small? Are they large? Are they ones that are likely to show up in a clinical setting such that they would have what we would call clinical significance? So as Mark just pointed out, this latest 2017 article contrasts some of the things that previous reviews have concluded, and also contrasts some of the things that you might read on a source like Paul Ingram's website. Mark, you said you're getting a little lag. You still getting me there?
I'm getting you, but every once in a while it gets a little garbled, and I'm just wondering if that's on your side or my side, or if we need to try to play with something. But I mean,
things are pretty good at my end.
Okay, yeah, I'm getting about 97% of what's coming out of your mouth, so I'm able to piece it all together. So.
Oh, okay, I think that's probably as good as the performance on this thing gets.
Okay.
So yeah, I think if we're above 80%, I think we're probably doing as good as it's going to get.
All right.
So this article is available. I linked it on my blog, and I also made an outline of the article that I posted to my Facebook group if people want to access these things. And Mark, what do you think would be the best way to jump into this? I'm open to doing it a couple different ways. I mean, we can sort of start at the beginning and proceed through it methodically, or if there's a particular, we can do it another way too. If there's something that we want to target and go straight for that and then unpack it, we can do it that way. Do you have a thought on how we should approach this?
Yeah. Well, I mean, my sort of the thing that's hanging over my head, in this conversation, is the mechanisms, and that is a deep hole of confusion for me, especially once we start talking about inflammation, and it's just all that, like using CK as this inflammatory marker. How much do we really care about that? Is that really the active ingredient in muscle soreness? Or, looking at the way Paul frames this as kind of like a complex physiology, and he uses the term muscle fever or metabolic stress. And so for me, I like that frame, because it's like, okay, I'm dealing with something that's super complex. We can't point to one factor that's going to make the difference. So I would really love to just, if you can say anything to help me get grounded in the physiology that's happening here before we start getting too deep into the numbers. I know that's a really tough ask, but
well, it's worse than tough. It's out of my area of expertise. So I'm not a physiologist. I'm a psychologist by training. My understanding of the physiology is extremely limited, if I'm being honest, and I do try to be honest. But what I can do is I can approach this as a methodologist, as someone who's done meta-analysis. I can certainly speak to whether the methods of this review give us any insight in the mechanism. And I can also talk about how we might need, when we look at a paper like this, how we might need to think about outcomes independent of what we know about mechanism, and also how we might think about what could the mechanisms be. So I can speak intelligently about that larger piece about mechanism. I won't, in fact, I was maybe hoping you'd be better at this. I won't be able to say a lot about the specifics of the physiology, because that's not my main area. So we'll see. We'll do the best we can there. And it's interesting you mention that, because Bodhi Haraldson was publicizing our talk today last night, and right away, participant, brand new person to me. I should have written his name down. Now I feel bad.
I've got it. It's Ryan Jefferson Booth.
Yes.
I saw that. Yeah.
Good. I'm glad you had it. And right away, he said, I'm going to paraphrase here. He's like, what's the importance of creatine kinase? And do we really know that that's how this would work? And is there any reason to believe that? And so on. And he was clearly talking about the physiology at a level beyond my understanding of these mechanisms. and posted a link to another scientific article. So it's pretty cool that there's audience members who are thinking about that. So we'll talk about that as best we're able. And, I'll just say one other thing before we dig into the specifics. You mentioned having an interest in trail running. If we go back far enough, my interest in massage first came out of being a racing cyclist, and I used to receive massage as an aid to training and recovery, and had a range of experiences, most of them good. Although last night, as I was preparing this, I remembered one time when I was really early in my career, when I was probably about 16 years old and racing seriously for almost the first time. And there was a guy at the velodrome, the bicycle racing track that I was competing at, who was, I think he was sort of trying out his new massage therapy techniques that involved incredible amounts of pressure, like to tiny little points. I remember trying it. I remember it being one of the most painful things I've ever experienced. Whether or not it was of any clinical use, I don't know. I suspect it probably did more harm than good. And I've often thought back to that in, when I've seen discussions. So many people nowadays, at least in the circles you and I look at online, so many people are talking about the value of gentler approaches. They're looking at this sort of old-fashioned idea that, no pain, no gain, and treatment's going to hurt, or, all those things are interesting to think about. So, yeah, I've thought about that in the past. Well, why don't we just kind of begin at the beginning, and we'll move through some parts quickly, and then I think once we get to talking about what the results are, and also not just talking about the results, but talking about the results in context, sort of talking about whether the effects. I think a big part that I can bring to this is statistical acumen. So for someone who maybe hasn't done a meta-analysis, the way these numbers are presented, it may not be all that clear what the magnitude of the results are. So should we go like that?
Let's do it.
All right. So in the introduction of this article, they begin by defining delayed onset muscle soreness as we would expect. This commonly occurs 24 hours after intense exercise and is known to peak between 24 and 72 hours. It's often accompanied by muscle swelling, decreased muscular performance, decreased range of motion. They note that the exact causal mechanism is not known, but it's likely due to mechanical damage and resultant inflammation, and they give a couple of reasons why that might be. They note that massage therapy is widely used to treat DOMS, and their section on theory I thought was very small. They say, and massage therapy is proposed to increase skin and muscle temperature, increase blood and lymphatic flow, and increase parasympathetic activity. I have problems with all three of those claims. How about, yeah, you do too. But we might come back to that and discuss that. But for the time being, they're really just saying that, this is the way that some people think it might work. They're not necessarily saying that's how they think it works. And we've all seen those claims. They say these proposed mechanisms result in relief of muscle tension and stiffness, reduction of muscle soreness, increased range of motion. They briefly mention changes in Hoffmann reflex. This is something I've come across as I've read various studies, but again, I have a vague understanding of what it is. I've read about it before. It's the kind of thing that I've learned and then forgotten like 3 or 4 times over now. Is this, can you say anything about it?
I had to go to YouTube to see what this was, and it's some kind of like, you do some sort of finger pulling and you snap off, and apparently like you kind of I'll do it up here. You kind of pull off your finger and you're like measuring the action of a finger or something. That's what it looked like to me that people were doing. It was like a lot of physical therapy students were demonstrating it.
And the idea of it is to see how responsive the nervous system and musculature is. Is that it? You're not sure? Okay. Well, we probably shouldn't say much more about that then, since neither of us is prepared to say a lot more about it. I know it's a marker of how the nervous system and musculoskeletal system are functioning. But the truth is, as I was saying earlier, not being a physiologist, it's not my area of expertise. They go on to mention that there's a psychophysiological response to massage that leads to mood enhancement and reduction of fatigue. And in fact, soon after that, they say, and this is a quote, "It seems that the psychological effect is larger than the physiological effect." I thought that was kind of an unusual thing to say. I'm not sure how you would necessarily conclude that, or if that's even really a meaningful statement. But and then they mention the article that you mentioned, the 2012 Torres article that showed promising effects, but was based on only 3 studies. So the Torres study meta-analyzed 3 studies. The smallest number of studies that you can possibly meta-analyze is 2. To meta-analyze such a small number of studies is kind of unusual. You would go ahead.
I see. I don't get what they're saying there, because Torres has 9 studies that look at massage, and I think maybe what they're talking about there is that they were only able to pool the data from 3 studies. Can you talk about? Does that make sense? And can you talk about what that might mean? So maybe that's all that they could, all the data that they could put together into a single meta analysis.
I haven't read the Torres study, so I can only speculate. I can think of 2 or 3 things it might mean. It could mean what you just said. It could mean that they retrieved a dozen or so studies, and then after combing through those studies, they were only able to utilize 3 of them. This is a common way to proceed in meta-analysis. We're going to see how the authors of the current study did a similar thing, where they started off with a very large pool, then winnowed that down, and then winnowed that down. So it could be that. It could also be that they are speaking to a specific sub-analysis in Torres et al. So oftentimes a meta-analysis looks at more than one effect, and the effect on one outcome might be based on a dozen studies. The effect on a different outcome might be based on 24 studies or 3 studies. So they might have had a specific outcome that they were referring to there. Whatever the case, they're saying that the promising effects discussed in the 2012 article was based on only 3 studies. And if we want to, if we want to see if that's entirely accurate, we would have to go to that article, which we could certainly do. They now discuss the method of their own study, which is a meta-analysis. So again, a meta-analysis is a way, if you have questions about an area of research, if you want to ask yourself, does massage therapy reduce DOMS? One way to approach this, instead of doing your own study, is to consider, are there already several studies that examine this? And there usually are. And then what you can do is you can retrieve as many of those studies as possible and combine their results. And there are sophisticated statistical techniques for doing this. We'll talk about some of them in the more general sense. We won't get into the fine-grained stuff of it. But one of the things that you do is you combine the results accounting for the size of the study. So, for example, let's imagine there were only 2 studies that looked at massage therapy for delayed onset muscle soreness. One is based on a dozen subjects and shows a very large effect. And another is based on 150 subjects but shows a very small effect. Well, if you just average those 2 studies as if they were equal to each other, that would be probably not very accurate, because one study is 10 times as large as the other. And so you account for that. You use statistical techniques to weight those studies differently, so that it's almost as if all of those subjects across different studies were part of one big study, and each subject is accounting for their part of the result in an equal way. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Great. So the first thing you have to do when you set out to do this is you have to retrieve as many articles as possible. And it's also important that you do this not only in a comprehensive way, but in as unbiased a way as possible. So you've got to get the largest possible sample of what is out there. In fact, what you're really hoping to do is not sample it. You're hoping to get every single study that is in existence. And in practice, you probably are going to miss some, but hopefully it's almost none. Hopefully you get every single thing. So they mentioned that they searched for articles appearing all the way back to January of 1980. That's entirely appropriate. There's little reason to think that there would be a lot of value before that. They mentioned some of the keywords that they used. So the authors go into scientific databases such as PubMed and similar ones, and using keywords like massage and delayed onset muscle soreness and some others, they start building a database of potential articles. They mentioned that they limited themselves to randomized controlled trials. This is very important. Mark, I'm going to put you on the spot here, but can you say what a randomized controlled trial is?
Sure. I think the key feature is the randomized part. So you take a pool of participants and then divide them into two groups based on chance. So this is different than just saying, here's a group of people that got massage and here's a group of people that didn't get massage. What's the differences? Well, there might be differences in those two groups before, unrelated to the massage treatment. So the RCT is a way of controlling for that factor. So you start with the same pool, and then in theory, the only difference when you create two groups is the experimental condition.
You're exactly right. And actually, in your eagerness to describe the randomization process, which is dead on, I would note that you might have even skipped over something that some of our viewers might not fully know about, which is using a comparison or a control group. So we might ask the question, why not only have a massage group? Why not take your group of people, have them exercise intensively, have them report their muscle soreness, then do massage on them and measure their muscle soreness again? Why not just do that?
Well, because of a host of factors. So this includes, natural history, like you might have that soreness might have gone away on its own just with time. Or the other big one is the non-specific effects of getting attention, being in a room with scientists and having them, doing stuff. All of those factors can influence what somebody might report. So the control group is supposed to help control for that. Although we might talk about the challenges of what a control group looks when the intervention is massage, and it's such an obvious thing that the person that's in the experimental condition of receiving massage is getting an experimental condition, and then the others, the control group, is often, like listening to relaxing music or getting no treatment. And so it's, in that case, it's sort of obvious that, which group you're in, and that might bias things too.
Exactly. So if we are going to meaningfully understand the effect that a treatment such as massage has on muscle soreness, we are going to have a comparison group. If we simply measure the people who are going to get massage before and after treatment, even if we see a difference, we don't know that difference is due to massage. And there are many reasons for this, but let's just focus on what a couple of the most critical ones are. One is simply the passage of time. Anyone who's ever had sore muscles, and that's all of us, that eventually that goes away with time. In fact, time is probably the single biggest factor in determining whether your muscles are sore following exercise. So the control group helps us control for that variable. Both groups will be experiencing the passage of time, but only one of those groups is going to be getting the treatment. So it controls for that. Mark also mentioned that in some cases, although we might want to carefully consider if that's true in this case, in some cases a control group is controlling for the non-specific effects of attention. If people who get massage are also being attended to by a nice person who says nice things to them or treats them kindly, so on, that treatment, independent of the massage, might be having an effect on how they feel about their body, what they're paying attention to, so on and so forth. So those are a couple of the things that a control group controls for. There are others. I think if we try to get into all of them, we'll get bogged down. But the essential point here is in treatment research, with almost no exception, you have to have a control group to make meaningful conclusions about whether a treatment is working or not. Okay, so in this meta-analysis, they limited themselves to and the randomization part is if you're going to take the trouble to have a control group, you take the further trouble of using a random process to help ensure that the two groups are equivalent to each other, that they're not different in any systematic way. So if you did something like let your subjects choose whether to be in the massage or the control group, logically, people who like massage or who are experienced getting massage would choose to be in the massage group. And maybe people who are apprehensive about getting massage would choose to be in the control group. And that would potentially bias how people's recovery would proceed, because people who like massage are probably going to be more receptive to it or do better with it, and so on. And so in that sense, you're not really testing the treatment in a way that is fair. One of the features of this article is I don't know if this was true in the Taurus 2012 article, but they had no limitations with regard to the language that a study was published in. Sometimes meta-analysts limit themselves to the language that they know. For better or worse, most science in the world, including in countries where English is not the primary language, most countries in the world do their science in English. Now, there are exceptions to that, of course. So usually it's not a problem. In many ways, it's not a problem to limit yourself to English. But sometimes there are studies in other languages. And in this area, where some of the studies were done in China, some were done in Iran, this may be really important. So they did not limit themselves in that way. They also say something about not limiting with regard to status, and I honestly don't know what they meant by that. The best I can figure is maybe they meant according to the status or standing of a particular journal. If it means something else, I don't know what they mean, but it didn't seem to be particularly important. They limited themselves to studies that had human participants without muscle or bone diseases, and to studies that compared post-exercise massage therapy versus a control group receiving usual care or no intervention. This is a pretty standard way to think about such things. If you compare massage therapy to no intervention, that is, to people who are just sitting around not getting treatment, you're going to get a good measure of what massage therapy is doing. If you compared massage therapy to mega doses of aspirin, let's say, that would be a different kind of comparison. If both of those treatments are effective, there might not be much apparent difference between them. You wouldn't know if both treatments were effective, if both treatments were non-effective, if both treatments were harmful. So comparing massage therapy to what is effectively no treatment makes logical sense. One of the things I noticed, and maybe you might remark on this, Mark, is they talked about how they selected studies, and they said very little in that section or in other sections about how are they defining massage. Did you notice that?
Yeah, well, yeah, they do mention at one point, that there's a large group of these studies looked at kind of standard sort of quote, I have scare quotes up here, standard Swedish or Western massage techniques. And then I think 3 or 4 that used traditional Asian techniques. And they tried to define that, and it includes words like plucking, and I'm like, oh, so yeah, the heterogeneity of massage techniques and just trying to imagine a group of studies. There must be so many different methods among these, and in terms of I mean, I guess they tried to control for the timing of when they're giving the massage, or when the exercise is happening, when the massage is happening, and then when the measurements are happening. But I just imagine that there must be there's subtle differences in there.
Yeah, so there's for sure, we're gonna say more about that as we go. They're gonna be combining techniques that are different, and maybe in some cases radically different. I thought a weakness of this paper is they didn't really formally define what they were considering to be massage, and I think they need to do that in this paper because it raises questions about what they chose to include or exclude. So, for example, I'm speculating here, but let's say they had a study in the pool that delivered extremely soft brushing strokes to a runner's legs. Would that be massage if it applied virtually no pressure? Or what if the massage was not even hand strokes, but what if it was, I mean, this sounds silly, but just to make a point, let's say that the therapist used, a dry paintbrush to stroke the athlete's limbs. Would that qualify to their definition of massage? The fact is we don't know because they don't tell us how they're defining massage.
Yeah, I mean, I'm looking at the chart on what is their page numbers here?
Yep, at the bottom of the page.
So, well, it says Article 747, but I'm looking at Table 1. Table 1, okay. And they do kind of break it out. Some of these are like petrissage, or like warming up with effleurage for 2 minutes, petrissage for 5 minutes, and then effleurage for 1 minute. One of these mentions that the control group has lotion applied but no massage given.
So you're right that they're giving us description of the massage in the studies they included, and that's a strength of this study. But a step before that, they're not telling us what they define massage as before they got to this point.
Oh.
So here we're seeing the studies that they determined made their cut. But what we don't know is we don't know precisely how they defined that cut.
Got it.
So I think this is, by the way, in case I forget to say it, I think this is a very good study. I think there's a lot about it that's very good, and I think the results are interesting and valuable. But having said that, I think not defining massage more explicitly, I think, is a limitation, or at least an omission in this case. They mention what outcomes they're looking for in the studies: muscle pain or soreness ratings, measures of muscle strength, either in terms of maximal isometric force or peak torque, studies that assessed serum creatine kinase level, and then the studies also had to have sufficient statistical data reported in the form of means and standard deviations. A side note here that I can mention is, having done meta-analyses of massage therapy, hopefully this is something that's improving. A lot of times the studies do not report the very basic statistics that they need to report in order to be of use to a meta-analyst. In fact, this was a major problem with some of the early studies that came out of the Touch Research Institute. Their statistical reporting was very lax, such that their lab had gone to all this trouble of doing a study, which is a lot of work, and then the study is really not of any scientific use to anyone who wants to review the area, which is really very surprising. I'm going to move through this a little more quickly. They say a little bit about excluding certain things like conference posters. They talk about how 2 members of their team worked independently to determine which studies would be included. And but what they don't, and that's standard practice for doing one of these, curiously, they don't tell us what their rate of agreement is. We assume that it was fairly high. So Mark, if you and I were doing this, we would have the pool of studies, and you and I would each look at it on our own, not communicating with each other. making a decision about this is in, this is out, according to these criteria. And then once we're done with that, we would meet and we would see if we got the same result. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay. And then we would hope our agreement would be very high, but they should tell us. I mean, they should, because if it's not high, let's say their agreement on which studies should go in and which studies should not go in was only, say, 50%, that would be pretty worrisome. And it would speak to maybe some difficulty in deciding what is massage, or are our criteria clearly delineated. I think based on what they've told us so far, we can safely assume that their rate of agreement was pretty high. And also standard practice is in specific instances where they have a disagreement, they consulted a third reviewer and made a decision. This is pretty standard. So to make this more explicit, if the two of us were working together and there was a study and I said, this is clearly massage therapy, this very gentle stroking they're doing, and you might say, this isn't massage therapy, this is gentle stroking, this is not going to activate any pressure receptors in the skin, now you and I would go to a third member of the team and ask that person to make a decision, and that would decide. Say a little bit about quality assessment. So this is, we might have time to talk about this a little bit more. So not only do they make an absolute decision as to whether a study goes in or out of the meta-analysis, but they also apply some standards from the Cochrane collaboration that evaluate the risk of bias in these studies, such that studies can be graded as high, low, or unclear risk of bias. I think that's maybe worth talking about. In my own meta-analyses, we've tended not to use that specific approach. We talk about limitations of individual studies, and I'm familiar with this approach, but it's not one that I've found very useful to employ in massage therapy. I think it's probably of more use in certain medical meta-analyses, but we might want to talk about that a little bit more. They talk about how they extracted data. In talking about statistical analysis, there are two things, well, at least two things that we might come back to. And you touched on one of them a few minutes ago. They talk about the issue of heterogeneity. This is a really fancy word for when things are very different from each other. So homogeneity would be when things are very similar to each other. Heterogeneity would be when a group of things displays a range of characteristics. And we can discuss the heterogeneity of the massage that was included. So as we were saying a few minutes ago, some studies might employ a very short amount of massage, some might employ a long amount of massage, some might use an Eastern approach, some might use a Western approach, some might use firm pressure, some might use light pressure, different anatomical sites. I mean, there's so many ways in which this can differ. So that's a type of heterogeneity. And then in the statistical sense, there are meaningful ways to see, are all these studies clustering around the very same results? That is, are they almost all saying the same thing in terms of how massage therapy works? Or are they kind of spread out? Some of the studies are showing a weak effect, some are showing a very strong one. There's an average, but there's a lot of spread around that average. And here they're talking about the statistical part of it, which, if you think about it, might logically be a reflection of the various approaches that were examined. Does that make sense?
Yep, totally.
Okay.
And one thing that we didn't mention earlier, but it fits into the heterogeneity, is the types of exercise that that we're addressing, right? So, and maybe there's different physiology going on. You know, one of the classic DOMS, you know, the classic way that you get delayed onset muscle soreness is that you do eccentric loading, and especially something that is a new movement for you. So this is especially relevant when you're the first time you exercise in a certain way. So like if you go for a hike and you're going downhill for a few miles, that's a big cause of delayed onset muscle soreness. But if you're climbing the stairs like you do for work every day, it's less likely. And so one of the questions I have is, are those physiologically distinct mechanisms? I know I'm kind of getting us off a little bit off track, but
no, it's good.
and then so yeah, is it different physiology? And if it is, do we really care that much about DOMs when it really only impacts a small fraction of the time that people are exercising right at the very beginning, whereas something like a cyclist who's training hard every day, maybe that's a different thing, like a general post-exercise soreness. Are those different physiological mechanisms, and might that account for some of the heterogeneity that we're talking about?
Undoubtedly, exactly. It's another example of heterogeneity in the studies, and I'll come at that in a slightly different way. So you were in your example highlighting the difference in, for lack of a better word, experience. When you're doing a certain exercise for the first time, you're much more likely to get soreness from it than if you're doing the same kind of thing over and over again. We might also consider whether we're talking about long endurance type of exercise or more sprint-based or more explosive types of athletic efforts, which we know involve different aspects of physiology. So all of these things are going to contribute to heterogeneity. So they talk about that, and also related to that, and now this is getting into sort of wonky statistical stuff, but I'm going to try to make sense of it. They mention random and fixed effects models were employed depending on results of heterogeneity assessment. Okay, Mark, any idea what those are?
No.
No, the only way a person's going to know what those are is if they are an experienced meta-analyst. And what this is, there's more than one way to do a meta-analysis. Sometimes you're combining the results of a procedure that's very, very specific, very well defined. So administration of an IQ test, for example. Let's say you're looking at how an IQ test is affected by, that's maybe not the best example. Let me give a more relevant example. Let's say there was a very standardized way to do massage on runners, specifically marathon runners. Everybody in every study is a marathon runner, and in all these different studies, they had a 10-minute massage of the legs in a very specific pattern by experienced therapists, such that it's the same technique being used every time. When that's the case, when everything you're combining can reasonably thought to be the same, you use what's called a fixed effects meta-analysis. You don't worry about the possibility that you're combining apples and oranges because you're only combining apples. You know they're all apples. Often, though, and this is clearly a case of that, you are combining apples and oranges and bananas and grapes and lemons. And before someone says, wait, we all know you can't combine apples and oranges. No, you can combine apples and oranges. You can combine apples and oranges if you want to say something about the category known as fruit. But you know that those things are different. So they're similar, they're all fruits, but you also know that they're different. They weigh different, they look different, they taste different. And that's the case here. We know going in that we've got different subjects, different athletic experiences, different approaches to massage, and so on. And so I think they made a mistake here too. They're saying we're going to use statistical techniques to make determinations as to which of these approaches we should use step by step. And I think that's a mistake for numerous reasons. The biggest one being, we know this should be a random effects model. We know you're combining things that are not precisely alike. In cases where the meta-analyst has a gigantic data set, there are ways to do what they're trying to do here. I think the way they're doing it here is of no importance. I think they should just be doing a random effects model throughout. In the end, I don't think it affects the results very much, but I think it's a mistake in how they thought about their approach here. Did that? Any questions about that?
Well, yeah. I mean, that was a good a good 10,000-foot view. Yeah, that seems like a deep dark hole of confusion that I could stumble into, but we don't necessarily need to.
Well, it is. It's such a deep dark hole of confusion that researchers themselves get it wrong, or at least argue about it. I mean, if the authors of this paper were here, they might say, "Oh, you don't know what you're talking about. Here's why we did it." And we'd argue about it, not agree, maybe. So it is a bit of a hole. I would argue strongly that all their analyses should be random effects analyses, but like I said, in the end, I don't think it makes a big difference. They go on to discuss how their effects are calculated. They are going to present the results as standardized mean differences. And here again, we don't want to go too far down the rabbit hole, but if you're going to compare a treatment group and a control group, now the question is, how are you going to do this? And when you're combining studies, they often will have slightly different measures that they used. So in one study, we asked people to rate their muscle soreness on a scale from 1 to 7. And in another study, different researchers asked them to rate their pain on a scale of 1 to 10. Well, it should be clear that you can't combine those scales. You'll just have a big mess. So there are statistical ways to solve this problem. And the way you do it is by comparing the averages and dividing them by the variation observed around those averages. Without getting into a very long discussion in which I would need to use graphics too, what you're doing is you're looking at the end point after treatment. So let's say my hands are a treatment and a control group in an individual study. And let's imagine my hands are in the exact same place before anything has happened. And you have your subjects do their exercise, you give them the massage, and 24 hours later, you measure where they're at. Okay, now my hands are apart from each other. This is the control group. This is the massage therapy group. The massage therapy group is doing better than the control group. What we do is we measure this distance between them, not in the points of the scale that were used, but we use a statistical technique to basically average that in a statistical way. And what it does is it gives us what's known as an effect size that is generic rather than specific to a scale. And that generic value can be compared across studies. It can even be compared across meta-analyses if you're familiar with them. And we're going to do that. We're going to talk about whether these effects are unimpressively small or are impressively large. We'll say more about that as we go on. It's going to be hard to put that entirely in the context. So with all that lead-in, we're finally able to talk about some results. Any thoughts or comments or questions before we start talking about the results?
No, let's go for it.
Okay. Okay, so they've gone to all this trouble, and now they're going to tell us what they've got. They mentioned that they initially had 882 records that they had to go through. This is standard to have such a large result, but combing through those records, they quickly narrowed that down to 70 potentially eligible articles. And then looking at those articles in careful detail, they end up with 11 articles, including 504 research participants that are eligible to be included in the meta-analysis. That's pretty close to what I expect. They mentioned earlier that a 2012 study done by other researchers only resulted in 3. So by their now coming up with 11, that's a considerable improvement. That's almost 4 times as many studies included in the meta-analysis. The studies came from the United States, China, Canada, India, and Iran. 8 were published in English, 3 in Chinese. Then they say a little bit about the types of massage therapy, as you were alluding to. They say most of the studies used Western or Swedish techniques. 3 articles used traditional Chinese massage. They say a little bit about what the strokes might have consisted of. But really, more detail would be better. This is a challenging thing when you're doing massage therapy research, to describe what you found or describe what you did in terms of the actual massage. but they do have hard data on the duration of the massage and the sites to which it was applied. And they note that the control groups in 8 of the 11 cases were no treatment groups, and in the other 3 groups, they were almost equivalent to no treatment. They involved something very minimal, like having lotion applied or something like that. Do you agree?
Yep. Yep.
Yeah, they're pretty much no treatment groups all around. They talk a little bit about how the studies were graded for quality. I'm not going to say, well, I guess I will say some about this. One of the things they noticed is they say that none of the studies blinded their participants. They don't mean literally blinded, as in, attempted to make the people sightless. What they mean is were steps taken to prevent people from knowing if they were in the research group, in the treatment group, or in the control group. They later note that's probably impossible in massage therapy research. I would go ahead and say that is impossible in massage therapy research.
Well, except for, I mean, there's probably some value in offering something to the control group that is itself, something more, throwing them something that's more than just listening to a relaxation tape or something, where something that includes some caring attention, or something that seems like it could be therapeutic versus just having them sit in a room. So I could imagine a control group that actually, has something interesting happening to them, and that could lead somebody to think, a participant to think, that I might be in the experimental condition.
Okay, absolutely. So let's say you wanted to take steps to conceal from people whether they were in the treatment group or the control group. You could do something that would make people believe they were getting treated. Are there any problems with that?
Well, it introduces, I guess it introduces a whole, whatever that treatment is, has its own effects. And I mean, I don't quite get what you're getting at. So yeah, help me.
You've got it exactly. So if you have the people in your control group listen to a relaxation tape, and your reason for doing that is to blind them to which group they're in, you might accomplish the blinding. You might not, or you may or may not. But also you introduce the possibility, however small, that intervention is also effective and is going to wash out the treatment effects of the massage therapy to which you'd like to compare it. And the term blinding comes from medical research, and specifically medicine research. So if you're testing a medicinal compound, you have a lot greater ability, just because of the nature of the comparison you're making, to blind people to which group they're in. So let's say you've synthesized a new chemical that you think is going to reduce muscle soreness. You don't know if it will, but assuming it's been tested for safety and you now want to test it for effectiveness, you can create pills, two different kinds of pills, one that has the active ingredient in it and one that does not, which is known as a placebo. And they can be alike in every single possible way. They can be the same size, shape, color, smell, if they smell like anything. You can even make it so that the people administering them don't know which one is which. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
That's blind. And so you can take steps that are so controlled that the participants in the study cannot possibly know which group they're in. And the beauty of that is, at the end of the study, if there's a difference between the groups, once the coding is revealed, you know that the only likely explanation is the compound that some people ingested and that some people did not. But when what you're studying is like massage therapy, where someone has to knowingly administer it to someone, and that person has to knowingly receive it, it becomes impossible to blind them to whether they're in the treatment group or not. Yes, you can introduce other treatments, but then you're not really comparing the treatment to no treatment. And so it's a big problem. or it's not a big problem depending on how you look at it. It's a big problem if you want to isolate what the effect of the massage itself is. On the other hand, if you're thinking about the massage in the context of the natural world, people when they get massaged know they're getting massaged. People when they're not getting massaged know they're not getting massaged. And so really the problem comes down to how specifically do you want to be able to say what component of the massage is working. At that point, you effectively become unable to say that because it's impossible to separate the delivery of mechanical stimulation from interpersonal attention, from the person's knowledge that they're being treated, and so on. And I've said in some of my writings in the past that in this way, massage therapy research is much more similar to psychotherapy research than it is to medicine research. I actually think that a lot of the techniques that have been developed for psychotherapy research are very applicable to massage therapy research, and that's the framework that massage therapy research in most cases should be building on for these reasons. And I think it relates also to their use of the Cochrane system for grading the quality of these studies. At the end, they're going to conclude that, most of these studies were of low methodological quality. And that's true if you're applying the standards commonly used in medicine research, where you can blind people, where you can ensure that the people administering the study don't know who's in what group, all those sorts of things. But if you apply those standards to massage therapy research, you're almost inevitably going to conclude that the studies are of low quality because that framework is designed with those impossible things in mind. Any thoughts on that, Mark?
Yeah, that all makes sense. I mean, I wonder, part of the question that we're trying to answer is it worth people's time and money to get massage when there are other options readily available, like taking a walk or foam rolling or something like that, or self-massage or something. So I can see the potential benefit in a study that compares those massage with one of those other things that is free. But it kind of depends on what question you're trying to answer, I guess.
It totally depends on which question. Yeah, no, you're exactly right in stating it that way. It's a different question whether massage works in an absolute sense versus whether massage works better than something in a comparative way. Those are two different questions. And this, go ahead.
Well, yeah, I mean, one thing that Paul Ingraham writes about in his article is he did a N=1 experiment of self-massage. He would do some sort of weight training, and then he would only massage half of his body, and then compare the results across, so I was also like, experimental designs like that were kind of kicking around in my head. I was like, what could we do with something like that?
That's interesting. I mean, it introduces a lot of problems, but at least it's something. At least that's. I haven't read that particular article of Paul's, but I'm definitely a fan of Paul's work and his approach to things. Can you say what he concluded from his little test?
Yeah, he was a firm, like, there's no difference here. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting. I think there's some. I'm not sure that if there is an effect, you could uncover it that way, but I still like the outside of the box thinking of trying at least something. That's kind of an interesting way to get at it. As a side note, I heard once, I don't know if this is actually true, but it sounds like it ought to be true, that at least one scientist set out to determine if cracking your knuckles is bad for you across your lifetime. And he, or possibly she, did this by only cracking the knuckles of one hand for his or her entire life. And concluded that it was not harmful. But I don't know if that could be apocryphal. I don't know if it's true, but if it is true, I love it.
I've heard that too.
You have? Okay. All right, so we've taken all this time to talk about how they built their database and how they looked at the studies, and finally we're at the point where we can talk about what were the results. And so what were the effects of massage on muscle soreness rating? They say muscle soreness decreased significantly after participants, or actually these are my words summarizing them. Muscle soreness decreased significantly after participants received massage versus no intervention. So again, remember, we're always comparing the treatment group to the control group. And then the results said, and I'm going to put you on the spot again, Mark, because I'm going to ask you what this means. They say N equals 504, SMD equals negative 1.16, 95% CI equals negative 0.72 to negative 1.60. Can you make any sense out of those groups of numbers?
Yeah, so N is the number of participants they were able to put into that, so the total number of participants in all of those studies. The SMD is the effect size that we were talking about just a minute ago. So, and I've heard this described as, Doug Nelson says, between, around 0.5 is an effect size that's maybe starting to become detectable in a meaningful way, but you would have to be an expert to see that effect. An effect size around 1 is something that we would say matters and is good and we care about it. You might need to be, or, and Doug would say this is something that the participant would notice. So it's starting to become meaningful to that participant. And then an effect size larger than 1.5 would be something that anybody could see. Like there's definitely something going on here. So that's kind of what's rattling around in my head as how to gauge whether we care about it. It really, we really care when it starts to get up around 1, but you can make an argument for an effect size of a half as being significant.
That's a reasonable description. I'm going to quibble with some of the details, but thanks for taking that on and getting us started. By the way, a shout out to Doug Nelson. Doug Nelson is one of my favorite people, and Doug Nelson was instrumental in helping me collect the data for my dissertation, which I did at his massage therapy clinic in Champaign, Illinois. Doug's terrific. So yeah, you're exactly right. So they're saying it's as if there was a giant study with 500 people in it, and they said on average, the people who got massage were more than a standard deviation better off than the people who did not get massage. And you went on to say that that might be in the ballpark for what we would consider to be a reasonably good effect. I'm going to be much more optimistic than that. I'm going to say that's a really big effect. Now, it depends what a really big effect is, but there is sort of a rule of thumb for this. And it sounds like what Doug was either trying to summarize, or I don't know if you might not have gotten Doug's summary exactly right, but I'm going to give you what is sort of the standard for this family of effect sizes. And there are other types of effect sizes, so I want us to be careful. But if we're talking about standardized mean difference, an effect size of 0.2 or 0.2 is considered to be a small effect. An effect of 0.5 or half a standard deviation is considered to be a medium effect. And an effect of 0.8 or greater is considered to be a large effect. And you don't see those very often. Okay. Now, what that means in the real world gets more complicated. There are instances where a very, very small effect might still be very important. So that's unusual, but sometimes it's the case. So there's a classic example that people who study statistics are taught. You know how some senior citizens take an aspirin a day to reduce the risk of heart attack?
Yep.
The effect size for that intervention is about 0.01. In other words, it's so close to 0, you can not even visualize it. And the only reason it was even detected is because the research to uncover it was done on thousands or maybe tens of thousands of people. You might ask, well, if the effect is that small, why does it matter and why does anyone do it? And the answer is, if the thing you're pursuing, if the cost of the treatment in terms of finance and in terms of risk is almost 0, taking a children's aspirin every day doesn't cost anything and it's not going to hurt you. And if the potential outcome is you live, which is a huge benefit, you might take a tiny, tiny effect size. So whether an effect size is big or small depends on context. But we also know more generally what effect sizes look like. So another thing to put it into context, in the 50s and 60s and 70s, there was a raging debate in psychology as to whether psychotherapy worked. And the quality of the research in those years was such that no one really knew. There were some people who said, oh, this is ridiculous. Of course, this doesn't work. Whether you talk to a therapist or not doesn't determine whether you get better. Some people get better, some people get worse. There's no reason to believe this works. And other people said, you're crazy. Of course this works. I've seen it work. There are studies that show it works, so on and so forth. And it wasn't until about the middle of the 70s that a team of researchers led by a man named as Gene Glass, who was instrumental in pioneering the technique of meta-analysis, did this approach with hundreds of studies that they had their answer. And many, many meta-analyses of this have been done since then. So there's a preponderance of evidence that, yes, psychotherapy works. It reduces depression, it reduces anxiety, it helps reduce suicidality, it helps people stop taking drugs. And not only does it work, but the effect size is quite robust. So for many of those outcomes, the effect size is around 0.8 of a standard deviation, which is to say you do much better if you get psychotherapy for depression, anxiety, and other things than if you don't. So that's another way, and I would say a good way, to compare the results we have here to something else that's been studied very extensively and has been shown to work. And nowadays there is no debate as to whether psychotherapy works or not. There are debates about how it works. There are debates about which ones work best, but no scientist in psychology worth his or her salt is saying psychotherapy doesn't work. On average, it works really well. Okay, so they're saying muscle soreness was decreased by over a standard deviation. And to my eyes, as a scientist who's done this style of research before, that really catches my attention. That's a really big effect in my mind. And they go on to break that out by 24-hour assessment, 48-hour assessment, 72-hour assessment. And there's an interesting pattern there. It's only 3 points, so it's hard to be sure what we're looking at as a pattern, but the effect at 24 hours is sort of medium-sized, and the effect at 48 and 72 hours is really, really big, like a standard and a half deviations. So it appears that this effect is progressive, that you do your exercise, you get your massage, and the effect of that massage looks like it takes 2 or 3 days to sort of develop. Is that how? Did you notice that or have any thoughts on that?
I was so confused by the timing of all this. I thought that these subgroups, 24, 48, 72 hours, are post-exercise, so that they're doing the exercise at time 0, and then they're doing the massage at one of these time points, and then immediately after the massage, they're measuring the soreness ratings. But I was so confused by that throughout, and I don't know. I still don't know if I'm reading that right.
And to be honest, I'm not sure that you're wrong about that. That could be what it was. And there's a couple places in this study where their language should have been clearer. And I think this is one of them. I think,
and just to tag on to that, I mean, if what I just said is true, that they're doing the exercise and then waiting and doing the massage and then a measurement, don't we think it'd be interesting if they did the measurement 24 hours after the massage? Doesn't there need to be some time there for physiology to happen before you measure?
I think that is what they did.
Okay.
I think we would have to go to the individual studies to be certain in every case, but I think in several instances they specify that the massage is occurring right after exercise or very close in time to after exercise, and that the assessments are taking place.
Can you say that again? You garbled on me, and
okay.
Just what you just said.
I think, and we can check, and the best way to check would be to look at the individual studies, which a very dedicated person could do. But my understanding was the massage was being administered immediately or almost immediately after exercise. And then the assessments were being made 24, 48, 72 hours after the massage had been performed.
Okay, and that tracks, because I mean that would be because a lot of these studies measured all three of those, and in all the three of those time frames, and that'd be something that would be easy to do. You wouldn't have to necessarily even bring somebody back in. You could do a follow-up survey, or call them up and get their results at each of those time points. So that makes sense as a design.
I think that's what these are, but I also agree with you that the presentation of the details around that could be done better. Yeah. So let's proceed cautiously with regard to that. Nevertheless, whatever the details there are some, I would say, impressive effects on muscle soreness. I was surprised to see they were this large. And the way that they seem to unfold over time, I think, is pretty interesting. They go on to talk about the effects of massage on maximal isometric force. And I made a note to myself that this section is one of the, so speaking of ambiguity, one of the things I've noticed, and there might be a translation problem here if these folks were either writing in Chinese first, or if they were writing in what was maybe not their first language, or it could just be that, whatever the case, each of these sections begins with them reporting that the groups were not statistically different, and it's confusing. And it took me a while to realize what they seem to be saying is they checked to see if the groups were significantly different before treatment. And it took me like 3 or 4 times looking at it before I realized what they were saying. Did that?
Yeah.
I made note about it. Okay, so that was confusing. Once I figured that out, it was clear what we were looking at. They note that the effects of massage on maximal isometric force was significant, 265 subjects, standardized mean difference of a half a standard deviation. I made a note here that something about the confidence interval and the p-value doesn't look congruent, but I'm not too worried about it. I think there's probably a typo there of some type. And then they go on to say that subgroup analysis suggests the significant effect is at 72 hours, but not at 24 or 48. So again, for another effect here, they're saying that the passage of time, in this case up to 3 days, is paramount. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, no.
Okay.
Interesting.
Peak torque, another way of measuring athletic performance or recovery. They say that was significantly increased after strenuous exercise, about 0.4 of a standard deviation. They did not find significant differences for subgroups for 24 or 48 hours. And then they also measured this serum creatine kinase level. And here my limitations with regard to physiology are going to be evident to the very limited extent I understand this. We're talking about a marker of inflammation that is going to be present after some muscle damage has occurred, or at least after metabolic activities have occurred that may or may not go along with the kind of muscle damage that occurs from exercise. And this was significantly decreased by massage. The massage groups fared about 0.6 of a standard deviation better than control subjects. And this also showed a time course such that there was a fairly small effect at 24 hours, a medium-sized effect at 48 hours, and a quite large effect at 72 hours. So at the beginning of this, you said you were interested in the mechanism part of it. And I said, well, I'm not a physiologist, so I'm not going to be able to speak too meaningfully to that. But looking at this as someone who does treatment research and understands statistics, one of the things that jumps out at me is not only are all the outcome categories they looked at generating statistically significant results, but the physiological measures and the self-report measures are all congruent and are all unfolding in a way that seems to have a trajectory that, day one, the effect is modest. Day two, the effect is significantly more noticeable. Day three, it's even a little better still, which suggests, it doesn't outright show for sure, but it suggests that there is a metabolic process that is being supported or enhanced. Now, what we don't know if creatine kinase being reduced is a causal mechanism or if it is just a resultant outcome that's something entirely different is at work, and this is a downstream effect. But it's suggestive, is what I would say. It's pretty interesting that this pattern of results, I think, suggests that something physiological and metabolic is being produced, possibly, by massage. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, this is a piece that really challenged my bias here, and it does kind of put us back into the clearing toxins narrative about massage, which is one that I don't particularly, I'm not fond of thinking about massage that way.
But does it though? Is this, I mean, in the general sense, I follow you, but is this really on the same ballpark as the massage therapy releases your toxins?
Yeah, well, maybe not. I could definitely see how it could become that when it, if a broad massage audience is looking at this and saying, hey, look, we see that there's a change in this inflammatory marker. That's the cause of the change in your soreness. And that to me that's a leap that I'm not willing to make, but maybe I need to start getting more comfortable with it. I don't know.
I think I largely agree with you. I don't think we can reach any causal actually, I know we can't reach any causal conclusions from this pattern of results, but I do think it is suggestive. And if I was a physiology researcher reading this, I might be thinking, okay, here's a causal mechanism that needs to be investigated in specific studies designed to unpack that, possibly. The part about toxins, it's interesting you mentioned that. I mean, it's like, is this consistent with that sort of toxin idea? I mean, it really depends on what you mean. In terms of, the very general idea that like, oh, massage releases the toxins and you've got to drink a lot of water after massage to flush them out. Well, if anyone who knows a little bit of science knows that that's not a very well-reasoned argument. In the more specific sense, is massage therapy maybe promoting a physiological response that your body's got to do anyway to recover from exercise? Is massage therapy somehow advancing that? That I think is a reasonable possibility, maybe even a likely possibility.
Yep.
So the only thing that's left in the article is the discussion section. Any thoughts going into that? You want to lead that off, or you want me to lead that off, or what do you think?
Well, I don't have a ton here. I just would draw people's attention to, they mentioned Torres here that says, that report, the other meta-analysis from 2012 that says that massage can alleviate muscle soreness 24 hours after exercise. So that's different than this one so in Torres, the biggest effect was found at 24 hours and they had no effect at 48 or 72. And the effect at 24 was a third of let's see, the effect size, I don't have the effect size, ranged from 0.6 to 0.1. which correlates with 1/3 of a point on a visual analog scale. So that's basically a subjective self-reported pain measurement. So people are saying they went from a 5 to a 4 and a 4.6, with not a huge effect, and that's only significant at 24 hours. So they start off this discussion section by saying, our paper is agreeing with Torres. We both find that massage is effective, but I think, when you start to look a little deeper at that, there's some differences, pretty significant differences in those conclusions about the size of the effect and when it happens. So that was a little unsatisfying to me, the way that they handled that difference.
Interesting. I mean, one thing right away that seems important is this study, this newer 2017 study, is drawing on a lot more data. So in both cases, we're talking about small meta-analyses here. 3 is a very small number of studies. 11 is a small number of studies, but 11 is a lot more than 3. So we've got a lot more data here, such that I think the conclusions of this more recent article should be given more consideration than the earlier study. That's not to say that the earlier study should be altogether forgotten. And I also don't know how much the studies they included overlapped. I would think that all 3 studies Torres used probably are in this one as well.
Yeah.
Okay, so that makes sense. I would really caution against putting too much importance on that converting the effect size back into a visual analog scale equivalent. I think that's very likely to be misleading. The effect size is meant to evaluate the results as a function of the variation among the subjects. So I think if you try to then go backwards and say, well, this is really like half a point on a visual analog scale, I think that's a kind of mistake to do that, because the variability is already accounted for. Whether a half-point reduction on a visual analog scale matters or not depends tremendously on how much variation there was to begin with. So if everyone in the sample was already clustered around the same point on the visual analog scale, and they moved down half a point, that's much more impressive and meaningful than if people were really spread out to begin with and on average moved half a point. I think that's the best I can describe it without graphics. So, this is actually a big problem in translating research for clinicians who aren't researchers. Is, we researchers tend to use these numbers that are abstract and decontextualized, and it's only if you're used to working with them in this way that you can sort of make sense of them. And so there's a drive to sort of put it into the style of numbers clinicians are used to. Well, this is like a half-point reduction on a visual analog scale. Well, a visual analog scale is decontextualized by its very nature. What does that even mean? I think the fact that the effect sizes are in the ballpark of medium to large effects for what is for what's true in treatment research more generally, and that they're statistically significant, is, let's just skip ahead to sort of clinical recommendations. Like, can a person use this study or the results of this study to inform clinical practice? Let's just go to that.
Sure.
What do you think?
Yeah. I'll have to kind of noodle on it a bit more after our chat here. I'm still not enthusiastic about.
You're not convinced.
No.
Why not? You've said earlier why you weren't, and I've sort of okay. So actually, this is cool. You and I have 2 different positions. You're a clinician, a scientifically minded clinician, but a clinician. And you're saying, yeah, I don't know, these results aren't sort of making much of an impression on me. I am not a massage therapist, but I am a researcher, and I'm looking at this and I'm going, oh, this is really impressive. Like, based on this, I would be quite confident that massage therapy is reducing muscle soreness and maybe also reducing the physiological basis of that. So why are we reaching different conclusions from this?
Yeah, well, so I mean, I guess it's really challenging for me to unpack all this. The part of it for me is the complexity of the mechanisms involved and the availability of an alternative treatment that might be more available for people in general. And so what really matters to me is like, is this a lot better than telling somebody to go take a walk or to do some light stretching or something like that? I'm aware that massage is super expensive, and a lot of people have, I wouldn't want to give my clients the idea that there's only one way to skin this cat. So that's a gross metaphor. So I'm kind of conscious of that, of do we really need the part where we're flushing creatine kinase out of the system, or is it more like we're just doing something that feels good and helping somebody through, helping somebody feel better while their body is processing this inflammation or this change? So to me, that there's sort of that underlying question is still there about whether massage is the best way to do this. So
yeah,
I hope that gives you a little idea. But I fully admit that this is like, my prior, my previous thinking on this is being challenged, and I can feel myself wanting to stick with my previous thought. So,
well, your previous thoughts aren't, they're everything you just described makes sense. So, I mean, one thing is the way you're coming at it is slightly different. So you're thinking about comparative effectiveness and you're thinking about cost effectiveness. So this study is not concerned with those. This study is examining absolute effectiveness. Is massage doing something better than nothing, is essentially what this is looking at, which is an important question and is probably the most important question before, in the scientific sense, is probably the first step, more important than the things that you just mentioned. However, the things you just mentioned are second and third steps scientifically, but they are the steps that are of most interest and value to clinicians in the field. So you're talking about comparative effectiveness. You're looking at this as a clinician and you're saying, well, is massage therapy better than nothing? Is that even the right question? You're like, that's actually not that interesting. What I want to know is massage therapy better than taking a walk? Is it better than taking an aspirin? Is it better than stretching? All those are logical questions. Because in the real world, we don't usually, absolute efficacy isn't maybe what we're concerned with. You're also saying, there's a question of cost effectiveness. A massage might cost someone $60, $80, $100, $140 an hour, depending on the market they're in, and taking a walk is essentially free. So we would actually need to do different research to determine if massage therapy is more effective than taking a walk to produce these effects. So I think you hit the nail right on the head why we're looking at this differently. Whereas I may be coming at this from the starting point of a scientist, I'm like, wow, like this is now in my mind clearly better than nothing, which is impressive to me. It establishes that there's an effect where maybe we weren't sure before. I'll go a step further. Because the effects here are pretty large, even though we don't have a comparison to something like walking or taking aspirin, my statistical reasoning is, wow, taking a walk or taking aspirin would have to be pretty good to beat this, even though we don't have a direct comparison. So I'm impressed by that. So, I'm now, as a scientist, if someone asked me, does massage therapy reduce muscle soreness? I would say it's very likely. The evidence is pretty clearly in favor of that. So it's interesting how you and I are coming from two different frameworks, and I think we're both right in our respective ways.
Yeah, that sounds really, really good the way you just said that.
We're both right. What a
conclusion.
I will, I just said that, like, scientifically, I'm pretty impressed. However, I think, there are always caveats, and I think there's a major one here. And the major caveat here is that this study, even though they mention some wonky ways in which they looked for the possibility of publication bias. Did you take note of that? Is that meaningful to you?
Yeah, I think, well, I don't know if that addresses publication bias. I remember reading somewhere that they like removed one of the, one study at a time to do control, to look at something. I don't know what that means though. You know what I'm talking about?
I do know what you're talking about. Before we get to sort of those details, do you know what publication bias is, or could you describe that?
Yeah, publication bias would be the tendency for journals to want to publish things with positive results. It might also include, study authors not sending in their trials that have negative results. So those would be the two. Yeah.
Precisely. So publication bias, this is also sometimes called the file drawer effect or the file drawer threat. If you're a working scientist, you conduct a study, and sometimes your study shows positive, statistically significant results. But even when you're studying something that truly works, sometimes you get a non-result. You can also get a non-result because the thing in actual fact doesn't work. Okay, but the key point here is it's much easier to get published a positive result than a non-result. In fact, it's worse than that. It's almost impossible to publish a non-result. And so scientists don't even send those in, or if they do send them in, journals typically don't publish them. Okay. Now, non-scientists viewing this might be saying, well, why not just publish all the results to get a fair picture? Well, that is what we should do, but it's not practical to do that. And so it turns out that one of the greatest threats to a meta-analysis such as this is the possibility that there are studies that have been done, but those studies are in scientists' desk drawers or file drawers and are never seen. So when the team of Guo, Li, and so on go to examine this question with a meta-analysis, and they're able to winnow down to 9 studies that show positive effects, we can reasonably ask the question, well, wait, might there not be 2 or 3 or 10 or 20 or 50 studies with 0 result that are never seen? And we don't have to do a lot of math to think about, wow, if there's 9 studies that show a consistent result, but there's also 9 or a dozen studies that we're never going to see that show a non-result, maybe the truth is this doesn't really work because we're only seeing this biased sample of the entire range of studies. Okay, so sometimes this isn't a problem. It's not a problem when the retrievable studies number in the hundreds or thousands. So earlier I mentioned psychotherapy research. There have been so many studies of psychotherapy for depression or for anxiety that the amount of no result studies that would have to exist to wash that effect out is unrealistically large. It's impossible that there's 100,000 non-studies because there aren't even enough scientists to have done all those studies. But when your meta-analysis is based on 9 studies, it would only take 1 or 2 studies of a good size, that is having a lot of subjects in them. It would only take 1 or 2 to get averaged into this to completely change the picture. So, earlier I was saying I was quite enthusiastic about this pattern of results. However, when a meta-analysis this small, we've got to entertain the possibility that the results are quite biased due to publication bias. And the researchers who did this, they say, well, we use this methodical technique to say, what if this study wasn't in our analysis? What if this study? Those techniques are fine so far as they go. That's better than doing nothing. But when you're and I'm saying this as someone who's done meta-analysis, when your sample of studies is this small, those analyses don't mean very much. What really matters is the logic of it. If we can speculate, is it possible that there are 2 or 4 or 10, that's all it would take, studies that we're not seeing that would reduce this average a lot. I mean, can we conclude that that's possible? It's definitely possible. It's maybe even likely. Did I explain that in a way that sort of makes sense?
Yep, absolutely.
Okay,
yep.
Good. So I think that's the greatest threat to the study we're seeing here. But having said that, if as the years progress, if this result does not get threatened by future studies, and if subsequent studies sort of are consistent with this pattern and with this effect, I think it's pretty impressive. And I think that logically, theoretically, I think it makes sense that massage therapy could have these effects, and that they would unfold in time the way that they do in this study.
Yep, sounds good.
Well, that's what I've got. You got any further thoughts on the subject or on the study?
No, I was just looking through my notes, and we covered everything that I wanted to get to. So
cool. Well, so did we, based on my notes. Well, maybe we'll call it a day there.
Great. Yeah, well, I just wanted to say that it was a real pleasure to be able to do this with you. Not something that I particularly felt prepared to do, but to the people that are watching, I hope that people will continue to get involved and volunteer to be a part of discussions like this. I think research literacy for our profession is super important, and it's going to continue to be important going forward. If we want to be a part of the healthcare system and get paid by insurance companies, this is the kind of stuff that we're going to need to know how to talk about, and we're going to need to know why it's important to fund research. As a profession, not everybody needs to know how to get super wonky, but we all benefit from having a robust research community for our profession. So I want to be a part of that, and I hope this has been a contribution to that.
Well, I agree. So let me say thank you for having such a willing attitude to try this out, and for having such a positive approach to it, and for having put work in to prepare for it. And I want to reiterate and shape something you just said, which is, if there are viewers who would like to do what you just did, I would encourage them to be in touch with me. It is not, one of the things I hope to demonstrate through this feature is that it's not necessary to understand everything that goes into a study like this to get value out of it. And that really what's important is to come into it with sort of an open mind, but also a skeptical stance. And those things aren't incompatible; they're complementary to each other. And to sort of to not be intimidated by research. I mean, the fact of the matter is these things are really hard to read, and if you're not a statistician, it can be hard or impossible to unpack what all those details are. But that there's no reason to get bogged down by that. And in fact, to just sort of flow through an article like this and take out of it what you can is a good place to start. And then I hope that by doing, this feature, that we can sort of do the things like, where we just concluded was really interesting, that the way that you and I had complementary ways of looking at this, whether coming from a scientific background or a clinical background, I think we both get perspective out of that. So I'm looking forward to doing more of these.
Yeah, and I'll put in one more plug for your Patreon page. If you want Christopher to be putting the time in to prepare for these things and other projects, throw him $1 every time he does one. It doesn't cost you much, and it demonstrates your that you think that this stuff is important.
Thanks. Well said.
All right,
Mark. Well, thank you very much. Have a good afternoon, and we'll talk another time.
All right. Thanks a lot.